Okay. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Saul, for, I used to stand in front of this, behind this podium and teach the Metropolis course that Enrique so ably has transformed, as he's done so many things with the AAD program, into something far better than I was ever able to do. So I'm familiar with this whole summer scene. Fortunately, the air conditioning is not yet overacting. I'm most familiar with standing here and watching everybody in the room shivering. But yes, I should also say that I'll try to explain a little bit. I know that many of you, or most of you, will help, if not all of you, have been to the exhibition, and so I'm not going to tell you much about the show. We can fill in some details if you have questions, but I'm going to try to explain a bit about what the Buell Center has done and what our, in a sense, project has been at the Buell Center that has resulted in this show, and also about how my own work and interests coincide with and diverge from also this. So maybe we can have a discussion about the roles played by the different types of roles that we can assume and different responsibilities that one can assume in the field, and in this case somewhere in between the academy and practice. As Helen noted in her intro, I'm actually, I have my own sort of background is partly in architectural practice, and I consider myself a retired architect at this point. So there's something even personally sort of interesting and complicated about switching sides and being on the other side, like asking architects to design something rather than designing something oneself. So we could talk about all of these things and many more things. But in order to do so, it seems to me that we have to have some orientation and some idea. So forgive me if I repeat things that you already know. This is basically just to ground the discussion, and I'll try to be brief so that we can have as much discussion as possible. So first of all, I'm primarily here as the director of the Buell Center, Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture, which is in Buell Hall, if you haven't visited it yet, with a nice new lobby emerging as we speak. We're upstairs, and you're welcome to stop by and visit anytime. The Buell Center is an academic research center. It's an endowed academic research center, thus it's named after the Temple Hoyne Buell, who is a Columbia alumnus, who donated funds to support the center. And there is really no, this is very much related to the theme of the series here, that there's no real project that is given by a center like this. Some centers have more or less, there's a lot of research centers around this campus. They're dedicated to different things, and some are more specifically defined than others. Ours is not. I mean, the Buell Center is actually, the only thing that we have to do is study American architecture. How we study it, what we study, whether it's historical or contemporary or, upside down or backwards doesn't, there's no rule that says you have to do it this way or that way, nor is there really a tradition that says this is the way to do it. So actually it's quite an enjoyable and challenging role to play, to basically have to define, as director, the project for the Buell Center. So the first thing I need to tell you is that when I took over as director of the Buell Center now 4 years ago, 2008, a momentous year turned out to be, for many other reasons than that, the first thing I felt that we ought to do is to define this small institution as an institution that itself has a project, to define it by the project rather than by the fact that we sponsor seminars and lectures and do books and so on. So it's more about, like, in a sense, defining the institution conceptually, and then adjusting the programming, adjusting the events that we organize, the work that we sponsor, and so on and so forth, according to the project. Okay. And because of this open-endedness, I was able to do that together with my colleagues, principally Anna Kenoff, who's the program coordinator at the Buell Center, who is currently up in the office, and I would be happy to talk with you if you're interested in other things that we're doing. the bottom line is that at the beginning there really was no clearly defined project. In a sense, more what there was a situation, a kind of really world historical situation in which architecture was implicated. How it was implicated and what was supposed to happen, what we could do in a sense, or could or couldn't do, or what our responsibilities were in this situation, were unclear, and I think they remain unclear. However, what we tried to do is to define a kind of a frame, to kind of assemble a frame around a set of possible, not a set of possible architectural responses, but a set of possible priorities for the field. And what I mean by this is, of course, that there was the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and the so-called foreclosure crisis, or home mortgage foreclosure crisis. By now, I think most of you know what that is, but it's not just an American thing. It was on the one hand very American because it was all about suburban houses going into foreclosure. Foreclosure means, for those of you who are unsure, what it means is that if you own your house but haven't paid off the mortgage, the loan to the bank, and you're not able to make the monthly payments to pay that mortgage, after a certain point, the bank owns your house. The bank owns your house anyway, but you have this kind of fiction that you own your house. And the bank eventually declares that fiction null and void, and they take possession of the house formally, and they kick you out of your house. So this was resulted in, and continues to result in a sort of massive personal and social crisis in this country and now in many other countries around the world in different forms. It so happens that because the real estate markets, particularly in the American suburbs, have been inflated, there was this sort of bubble, as they say, in house prices, in single-family house prices, and therefore the mortgages that accompany them, the borrowing from the banks, that this was so inflated that when there were enough people went into foreclosure, then it had a ripple effect and contributed significantly. It didn't cause directly, but it contributed significantly to the worldwide financial crisis. So, the detail of that that became relevant for us is that this idea of owning one's home, which is the core component of the so-called American dream, the American dream of individuality and self-sufficiency associated with an independence associated with the physical home, but also the mental idea, the idea of the kind of cliches like my home is my castle and these kinds of things. Now, okay, the point of that is that there is a set of facts connected with that are in some sense largely financial facts that have correlations with infrastructural, urban, technological, and architectural facts, like things like houses. So in other words, even chances are if you think you own your house, you don't own it. The bank owns it. The bank is, you've entered into a kind of contract with the bank to sustain a fiction that you own the house until you can't fulfill your end of that deal because you lost your job or something happened such that you were unable to pay, and then the bank revokes the fiction, basically. So the key thing is the fiction, which one recognizes immediately as part of a larger fiction, not so much the fiction of ownership, but the narrative, the story of self-empowerment, of individuality, of a certain kind of freedom, freedom from more than freedom to, freedom from government, freedom from the neighbors, freedom from the city and its problems, freedom from modernity itself in lots of ways. That is associated with this fantasy. So this fantasy, we began by recognizing it as a cultural narrative. In other words, what you were seeing on television, what you were reading in the newspaper, what was happening and is still happening in economic, social reality, has as one of its key dimensions a narrative, a fantasy, a dream, a kind of movie that plays in the collective imagination over and over and over again. You've seen the movie, right? One way or the other. How many of you have actually been to some place that we can call a suburb in the United States, by the way? Yeah, I figured. So maybe about half. Okay, so I have, because I realized that I knowing the constituency, that I have to try to explain some specifics and tell me if I'm going too fast or skipping over important things. Okay, so that's the thing to know, that what we call the suburbs, whatever they actually look like, are in part built on a collective or a kind of societal narrative, or a kind of dream, or metaphorically a kind of movie that the society plays for itself again and again and recognizes itself in that movie. That's at least the premise. That's one of the premises. Now, that's important with respect to the Buell Center, because it was a way, right away, of defining what we do and what we don't do. And what we don't do is policy analysis or economic analysis, or we're not a think tank, right? We're not a technological laboratory, we're not a think tank, we're not a social science research unit. We don't do, data per se, although there's numbers there. We don't do mapping. We don't. There's a whole set of practices that other people do much better than we can. We're a cultural center. We belong to the world of the university that is associated with the humanities and with the certain aspects of what we call the qualitative social sciences. In other words, those spheres of knowledge that deal with narratives, that deal with aesthetics, that deal with imagination and fiction and that sort of thing. And basically what we're saying is actually that the fact that, in a sense, this fiction is, in some sense, participates in constructing our reality, gives us a way in. It gives us a different way in than many of the other people working on analogous aspects of this whole situation. And we can, in a sense, claim a certain leverage and maybe even a kind of authority on these questions that's a little bit diagonal or oblique to what you read in the newspapers about the foreclosure crisis or the financial crisis or whatever. It's not just about the numbers, in other words. It is about the numbers, but the numbers belong to a kind of, let's say, collective hallucination. And they, in a sense, measure that hallucination in very specific ways. They're not caused by the hallucination, but nor are they imaginable without the hallucination. You take away the fantasy of home ownership in the way that I've tried to describe it for you, and you don't get the suburbs in the form that we have them. Necessary but not sufficient condition. Okay, so that gave us a way in. And then the other thing is that we do is we deal one way or the other, as part of a university, we deal with discourse. And in discourse, by discourse, though, we don't mean just kind of generically like what we say, like just talking, but more like the rules of the game of the conversation, the rules of that structure, or the assumptions that structure how we talk about what we talk about. And what was specifically important, and remains very important for us in this operation, is to recognize right away. We sort of claimed this right away, that even as basically the whole world was talking about the crisis that was kind of unfolding in these suburbs, among other places, the terms in which they were discussing this were very, very narrow. And to put it bluntly, I mean, they were terms that were, in a sense, a priori, defined largely and given largely in advance by the logic of markets. Now, as an historian, so I put on another hat, historian hat, I can tell you that that is not the only way to talk about a house or housing or other things. You know this very well. When, for example, you do your courses in the history of modern architecture, most of what you're looking at is actually not market housing. Most of it is social housing or public housing in some form or the other, roughly speaking, sort of canonical examples, when collective housing particularly. So that at least gives us another kind of wedge, like a way into the question that's a little bit different than the way like the editorial pages were writing about it and still write about it, and the way it was discussed in public. And then the last component, so that's two pieces. The third and final piece was this idea of the public sphere, the way that a conversation occurs in public. Now, a conventional definition, or a kind of, let's say, everyday definition of the public sphere is something like the media, or the sites of communication and exchange amongst a kind of generic group of individuals in a general and sort of homogeneous nexus or network of communications. That, of course, itself is reductive and inaccurate to simply assume that there's like this neutral space in which we discuss matters of urgency. In fact, the way we discuss those matters of urgency is configured, is shaped by that space. partly, again, not determined, but partly shaped by that space. And what we have claimed, and I've insisted on vis-a-vis the Buell Center, is that the Buell Center, in a sense, participates simply by hosting conferences and publishing books and things like that. Even if we just do it, neutrally, we participate in a corner, a piece of the public sphere. And the question, we could say we are participants and agents of the architectural public sphere, to put it in a certain kind of way. And what we became interested in is the way that public sphere overlapped with other spheres, which maybe spoke a different language, had a different set of assumptions and reference, and so on and so forth. So the example I just gave you, that the way in which we've learned to talk about modern architecture does not assume that housing is de facto a function of the markets, and yet the way the newspapers in the United States, and I have to say in many parts of the world, because there's a whole other aspect of this that has to do with the way financial markets have shaped cities and settlement patterns really around the whole world, that they were the nature of the public so-called debate was being determined in advance or shaped in advance by the terms that were given by market. So, and even public policy in the United States, in other words, the initial response by the Obama administration to the housing crisis, of course, what represented, there was a stimulus package, that of course was the other thing that happened in 2008. Obama, that was the first year of, that was the first election, the Obama election. So everybody expected a change. What actually did happen, as you may know, is there was a stimulus package, in other words, a certain amount of government spending, but that spending was not actually on housing, as it had been in the past. And one of the models for this was the New Deal, which is basically the American version of European social democracies, where the government builds infrastructure, builds highways, bridges, roads, and housing, and schools, and hospitals, and various other things. So there was very little of that actually from the stimulus. There was some, most of it in more traditional forms of infrastructure like roads and so on. That this became very political very quickly. But when you looked at what was going on with housing, most of what was happening was some kind of attempt to kind of back up the banking system, make the mortgage system work better so that you'd have fewer failed mortgages, but not somehow transform that system or replace that system with some other system. So it was very clear right away that actually one of the rules of that game was to not challenge the system itself. And of course that has changed to some extent publicly with movements like Occupy Wall Street and the associated phenomena around the world. But in 2008, there was very, very little that was challenging the banking system and the system of finance, and most specifically with respect to housing, the privatization of housing. Which we know factually is not a given. It's not necessary that housing in any form is a function of the markets primarily or even secondarily, because we have many historical examples that run the whole spectrum from fully sort of publicly funded to fully market. And so that was the first thing we wanted to point out. It's like, hey, we're not talking, all the options are not on the table. That's basically what it came down to. And so, okay, before I get into this, I'm going to take a sort of step-by-step through what we actually did, because there's more to it than just the exhibition. The first thing was this document. The point being was that what was not happening with respect to housing was a public conversation, a debate in the public sphere, or the overlapping sets of sites and spheres in which these kinds of, from every place, from universities to museums to television stations, to newspapers, to blogs, to Twitter accounts, to everything you can imagine, to personal sort of conversation. There was very, very little in which the term public housing was coming up as a possible response to this in one way or the other, or at least part of the conversation, or to use the European kind of language in various contexts, social housing. So we published this pamphlet. One of the first things we did was we published the pamphlet. It's a long story. I won't go into all the details of the pamphlet. But the premise was that we were not really being allowed to say public in public anymore when it came to housing. And this has a historical dimension to it. It dates to about the 1970s, when gradually public housing, for various reasons, was stigmatized, was associated with racial discrimination and so on, which it did. I mean, that's the whole point. This is why this is difficult, because these were very, very, this whole neighborhood really is a result, as it currently exists, of the mixtures of policies, public housing policies in cities like New York. But what was happening was that the the sort of, let's say, contradictions of public and social housing policy were being used as an excuse to privatize the entire housing system. And so that was it was like a bait and switch game, a game in which one set of problems was being used as a reason to kill the whole thing. Or not just kill the particular system, but to kill the conversation, to prevent debate, to say, well, forget it. We're not allowed to talk about that anymore because it failed. And because we were, in a sense, as an academic center, we were in effect asserting our academic freedom, if you can say that, to say, no, we're going to talk about this. And in fact, we're going to publish a pamphlet that gives you some ideas about how you might talk about this. And there are some terms, there are a whole set of concepts, like, basically the idea is if there was a real stimulus, if you were to spend money on housing and in cities, this is what you might spend it on, this is how you might spend it. And we convened a charrette, and the faculty and students of the school participated and so on. And then we sent this around to thousands of people, to housing agencies, and it developed a whole kind of culture around it. Simultaneously, as we were thinking about what else could happen with this, we started thinking about what other institutional settings could this occupy, what kind of spaces in the public sphere we could occupy. And it became fairly clear that some kind of exhibition, some sort of museum-like setting, which would have a different audience than what we could get with a small pamphlet or the kind of academic networks that we have, or even the policy, because this actually went around to a lot of policy people. It went to HUD, to Washington, Housing and Urban Development. It went all over the place. And they called, there was various back and forth with some of these groups. But we realized actually that's kind of part of the thing about not being a policy think tank. We're not doing that kind of work. We're doing cultural work. So where to do cultural work? Well, there are other cultural institutions that we might partner with. So we really just started thinking out loud about how we might partner with other cultural institutions. And to make a long story short, my colleague Barry Bergdahl, who is he's a senior faculty member in the art history department, architectural historian. He's also the curator of modern architecture at MoMA, the architecture curator at MoMA. We kind of got to talking, basically. I mean, it was sort of an informal discussion, and realized that maybe there was some convergence of interests here, because Barry had this series, maybe you've seen the other one, called Rising Currents. It was basically the idea is that the museum, picking up on some of its own traditions, could commission architects, or really teams of architects and other professionals, to work on matters of contemporary urgency. And the first one he did was called Rising Currents, which was about sea level change in the New York harbor, in which they commissioned a series of 5 projects to deal with the sort of problems, urban and infrastructural issues to do with sea level change and global warming. So, Barry was thinking about what he was going to do next in that series, and we're thinking about what we're going to do, so we wound up talking and comparing notes and eventually thinking about how we might collaborate. This is all kind of happening simultaneously, but as we're doing that, we started working on what became this document. So there are really 4 documents that are connected with this. This is now called the Buell hypothesis. It's not what it was not called anything at the beginning. All we started thinking about was, okay, let's say we were to do a project in which we commissioned work and so on, and let's get more specific in a way about the relationship between architecture, urbanization, and the financial crisis. And eventually what we developed was a 3-part research document. This is not available except on the wall of the museum in physically, but there are very, very few of these in the world. But you can download the full document from the Buell Center website as PDF anytime you want. And it's in 3 parts. I'll go backwards with it. The first kind of, in a sense, scientific section has to do with identifying specific suburbs around the country which were really like sort of crisis points. So sort of if you think about it like this, that the traditional, let's say, since the Second World War, up to about the 1980s, urban centers, especially centers that were formerly thriving industrial centers, like New York or Detroit or London, underwent a kind of crisis, an economic crisis, social crisis, etc. And so there are a series of problems in this country. Quite a lot of this has to do with racial tensions, which of course overlap with class tensions and various other dilemmas. And so that image of the city as a site of conflict, of crisis, and so on, has, in a sense, been laundered. It's been cleaned up by, in New York, people like our former mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, who basically figured out a way to throw out all the homeless people from Manhattan to attract tourists back. And then, these kind of policies. This was a deliberate project to, in a sense, clean up the center city. It's happening in Europe. It's happening all over the world. And what happened also with some of this is in many countries, not New York, but most other cities around the country, public housing was demolished. Famously in Chicago, actually, most of the big public housing projects were demolished. So, in other words, what happened was that people living in cities, this is one of the many dynamics that took place during since the 1970s. People living in cities, as a result of a kind of urban crisis, were displaced. And more kind of fundamentally, what happened was that the inequities, the sort of, let's say, the huge gap between the rich and the poor that big cities have always, in this country, somehow, materialized, was displaced into the suburbs. And so, effectively, the crisis of the 1970s in big cities in this country was gradually displaced into a whole range of other landscapes around the country, which are much less visible. So this is one reason it doesn't show up on the news all the time. But if you look at something like the 2010 U.S. Census, for example, you understand what's going on because there are poverty rates, there are all kinds of education levels and all kinds of things. So there's a whole kind of science that a team of researchers did at the Buell Center to identify specific towns, really, around the country in which this crisis was, in a sense, most evident. So foreclosure rates, people losing their houses, was one aspect of that, but it's not the whole thing. That's what I've been trying to describe for you, is really a systemic problem, a systemic crisis. It's not even a housing crisis, you see. This is basically a crisis it's a societal crisis, a vast, it's the 99%, 1% scenario, but in the suburbs. And these various cities, so we have 8 of them in this document. They're all around the country, in different regions around the country. And then simultaneously, we worked out with Barry and with MoMA how we could turn this into the basis for an exhibition. And then 5 of the 8 became sites for the show that you've seen. So I just have that up there so you can see where around the country. The other component of this is there are 2 other components. One of them is a historical montage. It's in the middle of the book. You can see it online. Of all of clippings from newspapers since the 1920s about how, basically since around 1930, since about the Great Depression, and then the New Deal, the first wave of large-scale construction around housing in this country, about that documented ways in which housing was debated in public. In other words, issues around housing, its financing, who lives there, what it looks like, where it's built, all those kinds of things, many others, and most of it is urban, how this was debated in public, and specifically how public housing, which was, again, saw its sort of birth in this country in the 1930s, government-sponsored low-income housing, how this became an object of very heated debate, and how it intersected with various other national and international debates, such as larger questions to do with poverty, to do with race, especially with gender eventually, and basically the big questions of the 20th century. So so this is a kind of document that shows you quite literally with clippings from the newspaper how this was debated in the public. So the point of this is pedagogical. To say, hey, for almost 100 years, this issue has been debated in a very robust and intense way in overlapping public spheres in this country. Perhaps we can continue this debate in a civilized fashion, around the new configurations. So that's part 2 of this. And the first part, really, which I'm describing last, is this sort of philosophical dialogue, the Socratic dialogue that maybe you saw on the walls at MoMA. It's a kind of play, as you might know, on the Plato's Republic. Socrates and Glaucon are stuck in traffic in an interstate highway in I-95, which is the big highway that goes down the East Coast. And so instead of walking around ancient Athens, they're in the car. And they're still talking and trying to figure out what's going on. And they're looking around and trying to understand this new polis, this new city that is around them. And it's a conceit, obviously. It's a bit of an inside joke. There are many layers to that inside joke. I won't bore you with them. But it's simply a way of being very, very, very literal about the philosophical dimensions of this, and insisting that this is much more than an economic, a kind of numbers game or a mapping game or something like that. This has to do with values, with narratives, with social imaginaries, with how we think about how we live, and not just with how much money the bank charges for the house or whatever. So that it's an attempt to move the discussion onto this level, this philosophical level, the level of values, or to put it maybe more philosophically, the level in which the relationship between facts and values is debated. So there are certain facts, and then there are the values, the narratives, the fantasies, the desires, the responsibilities, the ethical and political dimensions of those facts that come together. And architecture, it turns out, kind of sits right in the middle of all of that, because there are numbers and in a sense all kinds of facts, technological ones, geographic ones, financial ones associated with architecture, whether you're talking about just a generic house or a very fancy architect designed luxury apartment tower called New York by Gary downtown. It's the same system. It's all the same system. That became this document, and then by that time we had actually simultaneously developed a kind of curatorial strategy for actually making this into an exhibition at MoMA as a part of Barry's series. The call for teams, I mean, this was actually very, very, it's just very much part of the New York scene, MoMA, right? So there was a whole kind of little, we can gossip about it a little bit if you want, but there was a whole drama basically around, how do you do this, inviting people, getting people to nominate architects to be part of this, and so it's a bit like the Young Architects series that they do at MoMA. Okay, whatever. That drama was not our problem. That's MoMA's thing. Our problem was to use, in a sense, this platform to get these issues out into the public sphere. And so, from my point of view, this really was, it's a laboratory experiment. I sometimes talk about it like as though it was like teaching a studio, except at the scale of the entire country, with practicing architects instead of students as the students. So our job was, in a sense, to educate or challenge at least whoever it was that we were going to invite into the show. And the reason for that's not just to be arrogant, but there's a certain kind of arrogance to this, but it's also because this was not happening. These things that I'm talking about were not being discussed, and we really, and I still feel this way, felt the responsibility to, as an academic research center, to put this issue on the table and say, okay, nobody's working on this, it's time to work on it, like what you do in studio. It's put a problem on the table and say, an issue really, a question, and say, okay, what does housing mean today in this particular context? And what are the possibilities, what's at stake, and specifically, how can we learn to speak about housing in public in a way that we are allowed to use words like public in an affirmative tone, when it's not embarrassing to say public housing, for example. So anyway, those were the criteria. There were a series of usual suspects in the mix, and you can make your judgments on that. And so you have these 5 teams in these 5 sites around the country. The thing proceeded as a workshop through the course of the summer last year in PS1. I don't know if you've been out to MoMA PS1. I recommend it. It's a really great museum, and you can see interesting shows there. But they have studio space, and each one of these teams was working in one of the studios in MoMA PS1, and there were a whole series of open houses, like mid-review. It's like pin-ups, mid-review. It's really like running a studio for the course, like one of your studios that you're doing right now, except it was over in Queens. And there were public presentations and all kinds of drama, like sort of little episodes. The whole thing culminated in a visit by to my knowledge, this is the first time, I could be wrong, but Barry and I both think it's the one and only time, a member of the cabinet, the American, the cabinet is the sort of group of advisors who run the different departments of the government. I'm speaking to the people who don't maybe know how the American government works, but These cabinet members are the people who run the different sectors. They're like the ministers, in a sense, of the certain sectors of the government. So we had the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan, part of Obama's cabinet, come and visit all the projects at PS1, and because that was also the point, to engage directly with the people who were making decisions. But the funny thing is that actually, this is clear from the stimulus package, that they were not in a position to make to even talk about things like public housing, because it was politically volatile, politically unacceptable to, for the Obama administration, whatever. It was like healthcare. Like, you couldn't say the code words like single payer, which is government-sponsored healthcare. You're not allowed to say that generally. You will get kicked out of the government if you more or less, if you get voted out if you say that. So it was very sensitive. So actually, we were able to say things that public officials weren't able to say, whatever they think about it. But then we invited public officials in, and so he came in, he gave a speech. It's all, and all of this is recorded in the catalog. So the catalog is, if you haven't, it's down at MoMA. You can buy it at Amazon if you want. But it's a document of the whole process, including the various speeches that were given, the discussions, these mid-review discussions, the jury discussions, the interviews with the architects. I have an essay where we continued the dialogue that's in the front part. The dialogue itself is in here, the philosophical dialogue, and so on. So this is really a kind of précis to the whole project. And then finally is what we're working on now, which is another publication. We're not quite sure what form it's going to take. The working title is Comments on Foreclosed, and this has to do with what actually happened after the show opened. Again, I said the purpose of the show was to provoke, in a very pointed way, a conversation. By the way, you will have noticed that none of the projects in the show actually designed public housing. If you look closely, they're all market-oriented projects. But what they mostly did was try to invent new models of developer-type, market-type housing that were more humane and less, destructive than the current profit-oriented models. But nobody went all the way and said social housing, public housing. So that was an interesting thing. It was interesting to us that in terms of our experiment, nobody went that way. Everybody went kind of that. They take you understand why they take, like the politicians, slightly safer route. Architects have to survive too. But we have this, in a sense, not just the freedom, we have the responsibility, I think, to insist on this is nothing radical, I can assure you. This is not a radical project in any shape. This is relatively tame, but even then it's turned out to hit a very, very specific set of nerves in the broader discussion around the country around these issues. So what we're doing is now collecting all of the comments online. It was been widely reviewed. Maybe you've seen some of these things. I'll show you just one quick thing. In blogs, articles from everything from Architectural Record to like The Economist and so on and so forth. And all people love it, people hate it, people don't care. All kinds of responses. That part is great. But what's also interesting is the relative sort of, let's say, superficiality of much of the discussion. And again, as an attempt to sort of act pedagogically in this situation, to help teach and train ourselves to have something like a grown-up discussion, a more informed and enlightened discussion about these matters. That's the project. A critical, informed, enlightened debate about the relationship between housing and the world, let's say, as I've been describing it. In the United States, but the first word on the wall at MoMA is globalization. That means America is in the world. America is not the world, nor is it a model for the world. America is just a piece of a much bigger world, and has demonstrated its connections with that world even through these invisible circuits of international finance that threw the markets into a frenzy, among many other things. So, okay, and the world talked back, in a sense, to our little show, and it, okay, I'm going to start the PowerPoint here, and there are many snippets. So what we did is we've been collecting all the blog bits and stuff. There's TV appearances. This is the Chris Hayes show. This is an MSNBC this is one of the political shows that's on the weekend. There's Michael Bell, who was on the show. He's one of the architects in the show. He teaches here. And you know, there's I think there are comments from, like, you know, in the comments section on an online piece, that we're collecting all these. We're collecting Twitter feeds. We're collecting anything we can possibly find online. This is it's like a neutral document of all that stuff. It's neutral up to in the sense that we're collecting it, and then we're interpreting it by organizing it in a certain way. And then this will be published, and it will be in a form similar to this. This is an early mock-up, and there will be a website. So stay tuned for that. We hope that this will be online in the fall, by September or so. But let me just give you a sample of then the type of discussions that we're having. So, for example, one thing that happened this is the broader spectrum here. These are not the architectural magazines. You know, you can read it on ArchiNect and Architectural Review and all the usual places, Auditorium, etc. But this is The Nation. The Nation is a very old and sort of well-known today what's called progressive journal. It's a very political journal or magazine. It's a weekly publication. It has a website that is associated not, you know, with what's called left politics in the United States, but it's not it's not hard left or anything. It's what Americans call liberal or left-leaning. And so there's a certain political view that associated, roughly speaking, kind of Democratic Party associated with The Nation. And so this person, Alex Ulam, who's a writer for The Nation, you can see his name up there, he came to all the events and interviewed us and all these kinds of things, and he wrote this very long and very nice and appreciative article about the show in The Nation. So we're happy about that. Very good. Okay. What happens in the American public sphere is that these different media elements watch one another and they monitor what's going on. So it turned out then that Fox News, or Fox, in this case Fox Business News, was watching what was going on in The Nation. Because, you know, Fox is the other side. That's the Rupert Murdoch side of the spectrum. You could say, generally speaking, I'm just, for stereotypical reasons, leaning Republican, right? So so they responded to this by inviting Alex, who you see here, who had written about this show, onto their TV show to talk about the show. And you can tell from the subtitle here that you can get the basic idea. But I'm going to play this clip for you. And then we can hopefully, we can maybe, then that gives us enough to have a discussion about how we discuss architecture in public around these difficult issues. So I'll show you how, one way in which it was discussed. Here it comes. Okay, I have to do this business. I think we have to get past their advertising first, sorry.
MFS Investment Management.
11 seconds.
We invented the mutual fund, the building block for every portfolio. Learn more at MFS.com. MFS Investment Management. Choose what fits.
Joining us now is Alex Ulam. He is a contributor to The Nation, and he wrote about this exhibit in that magazine. Alex, welcome to the program.
Oh, you're welcome. Oh, I just have a slight correction. It's the Museum of Modern Art, not,
yes.
Not the Metropolitan.
That's right. It's the Museum of Modern Art. I'm sorry, I misspoke.
Now, why is it not? What happened? Okay, what? Okay, let's try this bit.
Okay, I do apologize. Museum of Modern Art, everybody?
Yeah,
got that?
yes.
It's right near here. It's several blocks away.
Yes, it is.
He's going right up the show.
I've walked past it on many occasions on my way to church. Now, it seems to me that this exhibit is from the elites telling us how we should live. We should all live in cities, and if we don't live in cities, we should turn our suburbs into cities. That's the way we should live. Isn't that the elites going at us and telling us how we mere mortals should live?
No, it's not the elite. It's the way it's the way our housing policy has been oriented for the last 20 or 30 years. It's unsustainable.
Yeah,
we just spoke about gas prices.
We should not be organizing ourselves and where to live. Now the elites are telling us how we should be doing it.
They're making some suggestions, but listen, it's unsustainable for people to live in suburbs.
Who says?
Well, most Americans actually spend more money on transportation than they do on medical care or on taxes. Like the average family, family of four that makes $50,000 spends somewhere between 7,900.
So there's now an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Museum of Modern Art.
Museum of Modern Art, whatever.
MoMA.
MoMA. Oh, yeah, I get it right. So there is now an exhibit pointing out that the current way we live, the kind of houses that we live in, the way we group together, that is unsustainable. And we, the highly intelligent people, show you how to live, notably like that on the screen.
Well,
Isn't that rather elitist, Alex? Really?
But it's only, you know, the lower suburbs have become, poverty is increasing in the suburbs faster than it's increasing in the city, right? In the last decade.
So we should all live in little blocks.
No,
I wanna jump in
we have to
here.
make these places more like cities.
I love this concept because I think the idea of the white picket fence dream is now starting to get outdated. That people have been wanting and aspire for.
Well, don't you think we can decide for ourselves whether we want to change our lifestyle?
But this is what artists are doing. This is what they do. They inspire thought. They inspire discussion.
God forbid.
What's wrong with it?
It's our housing policy too. Look at all your. Do you like your taxpayer dollars subsidizing developers building these tract houses in the suburbs?
Yes,
that are completely financially unsustainable?
Who says they're completely financially unsustainable? Who says this?
Well, why is poverty increasing at double the rate in the suburbs as it is in the city?
Because maybe poor people have moved out of the city and have gone to live
well, that's
in
the only
suburbs.
place they can afford to buy houses.
So we should but what is this? What is it called? The Museum of Modern Art?
MoMA.
Is that
MoMA.
it?
Just
MoMA.
say
Okay.
MoMA.
MoMA. What is MoMA doing, putting on such an obviously political exhibit? What are they doing?
Well, the Museum of Modern Art has a tradition of putting on.
Say, artists are never political.
It's always the elite telling the rest of us how we should live, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Always.
In fact, the state of California is enacting zoning policies to make suburbs more dense. You know, in the Wall Street Journal just pointed out last week that they have a law that they're trying to, instead of having 4 houses per acre, they're going to have 20 houses per acre.
What's wrong with sparking a discussion? Foreclosures are still on the rise. Home prices are still declining. I mean, this is
I just want to be left alone.
Concept. So
I want to live the way I wish to live. I want
museum.
society to evolve the way it wishes to evolve.
But you care about where your tax dollars go, don't you? You care about
yes,
where your
I will
tax
vote to make sure they go in the right place.
Yes. Well, so maybe right now too many tax dollars have been going to the suburbs. So maybe it's time to have the taxpayer dollars go to cities and making certain suburbs more sustainable and more like cities.
Does this MoMA place, does it have some kind of tax subsidy? Does it?
Well, they probably don't pay taxes because it's a non-profit institution.
So it's a form of subsidy, isn't it? Well, I will withdraw it, Alex. Welcome to the program, Alex Ulm. I don't know whether you'll ever be back again, but we had fun and we appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Alex.
Okay. Yeah.
Sit right
Hold
there.
on.
Oh, okay.
He's trying to get out of here as fast as he can.
No,
Was it that
I've got more to say. No.
I think my wife just texted about you.
Oh, really?
Yes, hold on.
Oh.
What?
Okay. I'll tell you in the break.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, I wanted to show you that just before we...
MFS Investment Management. We invented the mutual fund, the building block.
I wanted to show it to you just to remind all of us that architecture does not... you saw like models by architects who are teaching you actually right now in that setting. That's what was being mocked. And so this is like a shortcut to the principle that architecture and other, all forms really of cultural practice, but for our purposes, let's just say architecture and urbanism, are not a priori somehow separated from the world. We don't just live out here in the university in some, bubble in which we speculate sort of narcissistically on things. But it's precisely that act of thinking in a certain way. Whether you think it's good thinking or not so good thinking is up to you, but the fact is that one thinks sort of out loud with things like models and movies and videos and whatever that you're making upstairs. This field thinks out loud visually in public. That in turn involves a participation in public spheres. It's not, so this is also a way of saying that of doing away with this fake problem that, you know, that there's like architecture over here and society over here, and either we force one into the other or pretend that they're completely separate. Just, you know, basically reorganize that whole kind of map, mental map of your relationship to the world, and saying that actually you're relating to the world precisely by thinking about how that world might be organized spatially and otherwise. So this is what we do in places like universities, and it's also what is done in offices and other places where those models were made. And this is also where we come together. We come together in overlapping. This is what was being debated, you know, in a kind of pseudo debate, was the relationship between, you know, what supposedly elite. There's nothing. If you actually go to MoMA, I think you're unlikely to conclude that this is an elite space. It's expensive to go there. That's what makes it elite. But you know, much of what is MoMA would really have to be described as populist, and vice versa. That you're seeing a kind of populist criticism of this space. It's not really a criticism of the show. It's a criticism of the space that the show claimed, and you know, a criticism that we know is backed up by elite interests, by financial power. It's Fox business, right? This is not, you know, some local TV station. So, so the overlap between these spheres, between these spaces, is really what we were trying to kind of occupy and make sense of and intervene in. And you know, so the project in that sense represents an intervention in the public sphere into the set of public spheres in which architecture circulates. So that was the point of showing you this clip, and you know, as well as I could equally have shown you, you know, sort of sophisticated architectural writing, if it still exists, about the formal nature of each project and so on and so forth, and we would be able to have the same discussion, but in the other direction. So, but that, you know, to get this discussion going, I was hoping that I hope that that's enough to show to kind of frame the matter. So that we can maybe think more together about not just what this all means, but where it might go. So I guess now we want to have they're going to interrogate me, I think. And so we'll do that part, and then you can ask your questions. Okay, so what's the plan? Yeah, okay, you said? Okay. Okay.
We can ask your questions to you.
This doesn't seem to be. Anybody know if this one's on? Okay, here. It's okay?
Yeah.
Got it? Okay.
So I have 3 questions, but I think I'm going to ask you only 2.
Okay.
One relates to the entire argument that you have been posing. The other one is as you as a historian. And the third one is for the exhibition. Mm-hmm. So regarding the entire argument, the Buell hypothesis departs from this, I don't want to call it cliché, but probably it is, the American dream. Right. That it's acting in a global level. It's not, and it's not it's
not just American. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not just American. It's acting in many geographies.
Right.
And you know that sometimes, I mean, homeowners have been stigmatized after the bubble exploded for the eagerness to buy property and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But thinking about the map of the, I mean, I'm talking about the wall map of where those bubbles exploded, and I can't help thinking that in those places where the welfare state is weaker, that situation tends to happen more often. And this is something that is never acknowledged. So it's, it's not only acting in the side of the economic power, that yes, it does, but also at a political level.
Yes,
that people, I mean, it's a way that people have to protect their future.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we can talk about that. You want me to respond, or are you going to ask the other one?
I'm going to ask you the second one, and then we...
Okay.
Yeah. So the second one has to do with you as a historian. I was reading part of the text you were writing, and then you mentioned that that was a remedial project. And you just mentioned the fact that you wanted to somehow educate it. Perhaps sounds a bit...
oh, it's obnoxious, yeah.
You wanted to educate the architects, but I thought that as a historian, in fact, what you wanted is to take a revenge of some architects. So, I mean, the fact that remedial houses for architects is the subtitle of Learning from Levittown.
Well, no, I wasn't thinking about that, but maybe, yeah, okay.
I had the feeling that, in fact, the target was an entire generation of architects whose relationship to power was part of the an underlying condition for the situation in which we are.
That's right. That's right. I agree. Yeah. Okay, but we can talk about that too. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I like that one. Yeah. Okay. Let's start though with the big world map one, and go from there. Because yes, at a larger level, this is like the way I like to think about the relationship between the specifics of a discipline like architecture. Like, let's say, the fact that we know how to talk about a house in a certain way. We know how to discuss what it's made of, what its history, the history of its forms, the life inside, all those things. There's a certain language and a kind of tradition of thinking about that. What I was saying sort of at the end there is that it's important for us not to just sort of seal that off and say that's architecture, capital A, that's what we do. But rather to recognize that it's exactly that sort of specificity, this sort of specific knowledge that you're acquiring here right now in an architecture school that allows participation in the larger world, and in this case in larger debates. So it's like a way in, it's like leverage into the larger debates. I mean, if one was a kind of economist, that would be the economist's way in. If one is a nuclear physicist, they have another way. But the point is that to gain access to larger sort of what we could call universal questions, like the question of privatization. What I mean by universal means it's a worldwide question. This basic process of financialization and privatization, right? You're familiar with this one way or the other. It's happening all over the world. And it has happened. It's an historical process, and it's not uniform and it's not monolithic. But it is something that we can name, right? And we know what we're talking about it when we name it. But because it's, when we name something so general as financialization, like the making abstract of a house. It's not just, even the idea of ownership is abstract. I don't own it, the bank owns it, and we have this deal with the bank. So, and even the bank doesn't own it, but some other bank that owns that bank, the bank that owns the bundle of mortgages, so basically your house, if you own a house, is being traded in a securities market in Hong Kong, for example, even if it's in New Jersey, the house. So that type of relationship is very, very abstract. It's hard to grasp. And actually what I think being very specific about it does, it gives us a handle on it. It gives us a way to dig deeper into it so that we get past the generalizations. We need the generalizations to get into it, but then we get past the generalizations and we try to get more specific. And that's why actually one of the first things, I didn't say this, but even the idea of like the suburbs is the first generalization to get past. There is no such thing as a typical suburb in this country or any other country. Just as you know very well, there's no such thing as a typical city. Yes, there are certain characteristics that make these places what they are and not classical cities. And that there's a certain, let's say, ethos to that. There's a set of policies. There's an economic paradigm in a way, and all those things have macro and micro dimensions to them. But the wager of the whole project is that by working very specifically on the ground in a very hypothetical way, you at the micro level you gain access to macro, and the macro is what you're describing, the privatization, and so on. Now, if you did this project in Spain, or if you did it in Greece, or if you did it in Portugal, I'm just naming some obvious, then we could keep going. Then it would look different. But okay.
One of the things, the construction of a certain narrative, the narrative of the American dream, runs in parallel with the destruction of certain narratives, and among them, the construction of the welfare state.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So it's a two-side project.
That's totally right. And this is also where it's very different. Like we could go around the room. I'm sure it'd be a very interesting discussion to go around the room and to compare the different. They're not just national narratives. Some of them are historical in other ways. So for example, the so-called welfare state was never really, fully existent in the United States. America is a kind of, in the post-war period, especially after the New Deal and after the war, things like Medicare and Medicaid, you know, certain healthcare systems and so on, public housing, public schools, these kinds of things are components of a kind of piecemeal version of the welfare state that nevertheless exists, runs parallel with, you know, this sort of the idea, what we call Wall Street, basically. You know, in other words, you have Washington and Wall Street sort of fighting it out and usually collaborating. The New Deal is actually a collaboration between Washington and Wall Street that actually was always intended to produce home ownership. It's not some socialist conspiracy. Whereas in Europe, you have much more classical, you could say, forms of social democracy, of state socialism, and communism. Likewise, in Asia and in Latin America, you could, you know, go around the world, and the different socioeconomic systems or political systems could be mapped onto this problem in general terms. So, for example, one of the things that I did when we first started thinking about this was I taught a studio on public housing in Mumbai. India was a socialist country until the early 1990s, and therefore had a very robust public housing and various other publicly supported programs, and was much more than a welfare state in a way. And yet today, it's probably even hard. It actually is even harder to talk about this in Mumbai in this way than it is in New York, because the force of financialization and privatization is so strong in that city that architecture basically is a diagram of the real estate markets in Mumbai. So, you know, that's another example of how this thing travels around the world. Yeah. Okay, another question, right? The other question about the internal debate in architecture. Yes, you know, and you know that I've been involved in those debates for some time, but you know, I'd say it's more like an educational exercise than a sort of j'accuse. I mean, you see what I mean? It's, yes, of course, it's a critique.
Exactly.
I think that's the first step. But it's hopefully a kind of critique amongst friends and kind of grown-ups. So it's not an accusation more than it is an invitation to sort of, okay, we had our fun. Now let's you know, sober up and get serious. And to some extent, I think, you know, whatever because, you know, if you read my own essay in the catalog, you can see that I'm very critical of some aspects of the work. But I think to some extent, actually, the show did actually manage to, the discussions that did occur around the projects managed to achieve a level of, let's say, gravity that you know, there were lots of debates in these informal workshops and so on about the role of the state, about finance, about you know, ownership, and about aesthetics, also about form, in relation to these other processes. So, you know, for me, it's important that as a teacher, and yes, one is being a little bit obnoxious in saying that one can, in a sense, try to teach an entire field a certain kind of lesson, but it's not an accusatory lesson. It's sort of like, okay, come on, we have to deal with this, right? And so maybe we can learn to work together on it. Yeah. And what do we do? You have?
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
I mean, this sort of goes back to, you know, you talked about the process beginning with this sort of public housing and new conversation,
yeah, right.
And you've talked about how, you know, you wanted to be, or people to be able to say public in public again.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what you make of what the projects, you know, how they actually engage with that question of the public and the public housing. And I think this kind of goes back to the kind of unusual curatorial project in that it is almost like a studio, and that you don't, I mean, you set up the conditions that people are working within, but you don't control the outcome. That's and you don't know exactly what projects are going to come out of that process. So it's kind of a two-part question. You know, what do you make of how teams kind of engaged with the question of public versus what you had initially sort of wanted to open up by kind of using that term? And just kind of as a side question, I mean, it's interesting that at the end of the catalogue, your kind of dialogue does critique the projects. So I'm kind of wondering about that as a curatorial strategy, the kind of, you know, sort of critique of the exhibition within the exhibition. Right.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I should say that we did try to do, Barry and I both, and we actually had a whole selection committee, and we tried to avoid homogeneity. I mean, of course, there's a certain kind of vanguardism that is associated with the projects and with MoMA and whatever, but within that frame, I think one can't say that all of the projects in this show are on the same team. There are certain internal debates even amongst the projects, different approaches, different levels of different. Some of the projects are more realistic than others. Some are more rhetorical. Some more take different positions on details. Another reason I wanted to show the clip from Fox was to insist on the priority of thinking about how others are talking about it, as well as what we think about it. See, once it acquires this kind of independent life out there, and this is what happens. So actually, that's as interesting to me as it is what I think about the project. So I've always resisted answering that question. What do you think about it? Of course, they were asking the whole time, and I withheld, and I still, to some extent, withhold direct commentary on this or that project because I really feel that's not my role. It's like saying, it sounds patronizing, excuse me, but if you're running your experiment, and it's the rats in a maze, and there are 5 rats, and they're all running. I like this rat or that rat. It's not that. I mean, it's what's happening in the maze. It's what's interesting, and then how that connects with other mazes and things like that. And I don't mean that in a demeaning or a kind of derogatory sense. I mean that actually is out of respect for the thoughtfulness of these people. So that was the interesting thing, to see people struggle with this. What is very funny, and this guy basically thought this was socialist, and that's pretty much if you know how to speak, I don't know, if you don't, this is a decoding of the American debate, right? Basically, what he was saying is, he says elitist, he basically means socialist. So whatever, don't worry about it. You don't have to understand. Just that's, or various other forms of state government control, like top-down management. And so, and of course this is not. I mean, if you actually look at this, as I said, these are not socialist projects, whether politically, typologically, economically, anything. They are mostly collective dwellings, though, and that was actually one of the consistencies, and in that sense, the observation is correct, that what's different here, and nobody really, 1 or 2 projects leaned a little bit that way, but most of them, typologically speaking, went in the direction of collective dwellings, high density, large-scale interventions. Now, the interesting thing is that this was criticized from the other end of the spectrum as well, from the sort of the component. This is particularly I cannot call this the left, but this is sometimes a self-identified left that is associated with the ideas of people like Jane Jacobs. Now, because Jane Jacobs is a very complex figure, and Helen, of all people, I mean, you have an absolute expert with Helen in the historical problems and complexities with her own PhD work, I'm just telling you, in participatory design and bottom-up housing processes. And so, and Helen's work to me is that really, your work really is a revelation in the context of Lima and Peru on the complexities of the relationship between states and markets and other actors in producing bottom-up housing. But the show was criticized for being very top-down, and it is. I mean, that's a fair criticism. And I tried to say that in my own essay in the catalog also, that there were very few actual members of the public that were invited to offer their thoughts on what things ought to be. There were a few interviews and things like that by housing activists. But there was, so this was criticized from the side of sort of activist design, and there's another business about the MoMA, not being on the side of the 99% and so on and so forth. And there, we've actually replied to that. We're convening a roundtable discussion on the website Places Design Observer, which you may know is a place where these things happen, where we invited some activists. I wrote something and some people responded to it, but the point is to make the case that what's on the table here is not bottom up versus top down. That's part of this, the problem, but what's on the table here really has to do with agency, with power. And the fact is that many of the, like for example, if you saw the show Small Scale Big Change, which was at MoMA before, I mean, to state it somewhat diplomatically, this is not that show. This is not about, you know, charity work in building schools in Africa so that Hollywood can feel good about, you know, investing in real estate in Los Angeles. I mean, this is about the contradictions of the city, or in this case, the suburb, which is to say that, you know, bottom-up is often in the service of the markets, not an alternative to them. However, that's sort of like on the table, and that wasn't really discussed. We're hoping that that can be discussed more in the aftermath of the show. We're trying to encourage that. So it's more about the processes and the kind of general approaches than the specific projects that I'm willing to to respond. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, I suppose I'll leave it at that, and if you want me to say more.
Just, but I mean, there's another side of this top to bottom aspect which I appreciate in the show that was absent, which is the context of, I mean, the voice of the drama. In other words, I mean, Socrates is okay, but there's no enough Sophocles.
Yes.
You know, there's no tragedy. I mean,
oh, come on, it's a comedy.
You know,
tragedy, from tragedy to farce.
I mean, it's even more tragic than the tragedy of Sophocles.
I know. I'm glad you got the joke.
No, but the paternal figure of the American dream killed finally the son. In a way. I mean, so. And not only that, I mean, this conspicuously absent. I mean, like the voices of those who have been.
Yes,
foreclosed.
that's right.
Not only
that's
that,
right. Yeah.
I mean, the sites, the actual lots and all that.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I guess the best way to put, you know, there's a little piece by Teddy Cruz in the front of the show, and Teddy is a member of the Buell Center board, and I have a board of advisors that we work with, but Teddy and I have a running debate about this because I think that I respect very much what Teddy's doing, but I always try to explain to Teddy that actually he's a developer, and this is about really asking: is it possible to imagine an architecture without developers? In which Teddy's problem would not be a problem. It's not. There would be other problems, but his particular problem of how to survive in the markets by empowering impoverished Latina women to act as developers on behalf of other Latina women, to draw them into the markets, is, you know, it's like micro-lending, is not the only way into this question. And the other way into this question is to draw a line and say enough of this. And historically and at the present, we know that there are other possibilities. So my question to Teddy is what if there was a real public housing policy here or anywhere else? This is really what this is about. What would you do? You would build it in the suburbs, and you would do it in a way that tries to not make the same mistakes 100,000 times by building ghettos and you know, isolating people and doing all the things that modernist housing did. So that's the you know, in a sense, the shorthand answer to the question. The critique, the voices are completely absent. That's a big critique of the show. I take responsibility for not pushing that enough. I wish that's a regret that I have personally. But at the same time, because that's the case, we just sort of allowed it to play itself out. That we can now say, look, the habits of this field are unacceptable. We have to learn, when we're discussing cities, whether they're in the middle of nowhere or in you know, middle of Manhattan, we have to now, basically, part of growing up is learning to have this kind of discussion with many different agents, many different stakeholders, so to speak, or constituents, and not just, you know, and this applies to what you're doing upstairs in studios. I mean, you know, when you go, I can assure you that when we went to Mumbai, that was what the students immediately wanted to do. And happily, you know, endlessly discussing with NGOs and whatever, and meeting impoverished people. But the aestheticization of poverty is the first thing that has to be overcome in order to have a sort of real and politically empowering discussion, not a patronizing discussion. But because, frankly, that's the small-scale big change problem. The patronizing discussion is not acceptable either. So
now we wanted to open session.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think you need a microphone.
I have a question about how the whole process of the exhibition worked, because you mentioned a lot about public housing and how you wanted this group of architects kind of to respond to that. However, the show, the exhibition is called Foreclosed, the American Dream. which for someone maybe at Fox that don't go to the exhibition probably means something else,
Right.
and they don't get to the public
Of course,
housing.
yeah.
So how did the title
Yeah, it's a
evolve?
good question. Well, I wanted to use the word public in the title, and there are various reasons that that was rejected. But you know, this is a collaboration amongst many, many different players, and that's how it goes. Foreclosed has a double meaning. Just so you know, it's in English. This is really only in English, but foreclosed meaning the technical definition that I gave you of losing, you know, the bank taking the house back, but also foreclosed in the sense of preempted, of prevented you. In other words, the debate is foreclosed. It's closed in advance. That's the point. So the debate, that was the point about public, that any discussion about publicness, public housing, role of government beyond just propping up the banks was foreclosed.
It's very much there is no alternative.
Yes, right, exactly, right. And so this is just, that's the point of this whole thing, is that's why there is no correspondence between that assumption, you know, the boarded up houses and what's in the show. Is that you should be surprised, hopefully. And I have to say, like, actual humans who go to see the show, not architecture critics, but whatever, and you see this in the Twitter feeds and so on, there tends to be a certain amount of surprise. It may be jarring to some people, it might be annoying, it might be pleasurable, but I think what you're describing has actually happened in a way that I don't, you know, I think is fine. And of course the American dream part of it is another, it's a cliche. Look, but it is something that enough people think that they know something about, that was our wager at least, that it would draw the main thing is to get people into the show, read the book, you know, whatever. And I think that has worked. I mean, a lot of people, as you could see from all the commentary, but also if you go there, it's very crowded all the time. People are looking at it. And it's sort of a funny thing that people actually do look at art. The other thing I should say is that we insisted curatorially on the models, on big models, with the, you know, double assumption, and I think that has more or less proven accurate, that models will concretize things in a specialized way. Like models is where you get architecture, capital A, like we can have a very scientific debate about the formal language of each project. We can discuss its precedents. We need is, you know, the model is just as in a jury, everybody talks about the model. And a more general public or publics can also gain access to it. And actually what you have is, which I think is kind of interesting, is a wide range. You have very figurative models with lots of little people in them, and then you have very abstract models which look more like, you know, modernist sculpture. And each one of those communicates differently and therefore encourages some other, and in general, many people, I mean, the general consensus seems to be in favor of the more populist forms of representation. Yeah. But that's not surprising. Yeah.
Okay, so I think you already discussed what I'm going to ask, but I want some more clarification. In the beginning of your lecture, you were talking about the idea of the public sphere or public domain, and how it's a space where the collective meets, and, well, at least my understanding of it, you have people of different classes meet and have like this common idea
ideally, yes,
of the future of society, and then I'm guessing like why. If you had that idea in mind, why did you choose a place like the MoMA that, even though it attracts a lot of people, not necessarily you have people of different strata, like of different classes, and because of what you said, like it's very elite in terms of like the ticket you have to pay, and I guess also like I wanted to know in the process of the design, how much of it was it participatory, like did architects have interaction with people that actually lived in these public housings, and how they lived, and what were the issues, not only with the political part. Okay. Right.
Now, you're vis-a-vis the sort of, you know, MoMA's MoMA, and it is what it is, and so that was a sort of calculated, you know, first of all, you take, you know, you know, there are certain options, and we're constantly discussing in the Buell Center what our options are, and in this case, this option presented itself. It seemed a worthwhile trade-off. We knew very well that was the trade-off. But the trade-off was, you know, basically that, of course, in terms of ticket price and everything else about MoMA, it wouldn't be available there. But I don't think that that's ever a reason not to do an exhibition in a museum, because you could say, what are we doing here? This is more expensive than MoMA, and here we are, and we're doing what we do. It's like there are certain things that are possible, and to be actually even more explicit, I would say there are certain responsibilities that elite institutions like Columbia and the Museum of Modern Art have. And this was really a call to both of these institutions to their responsibilities. So in this case, the responsibility is one maybe more of translation than given the constraints of that, we're not going to affect the ticket price at MoMA, just as which I wish that you didn't have to pay a huge tuition to come here, but that's what we're stuck with. But we try to, in a sense, transgress that in other ways. So we've attempted to, and this occupying these other public spheres, the internet has actually turned into a rather useful space for this. And then if because that's why we're doing this comments project. If you read the comments project, you realize that this is not, at that point, this is a very everyday audience. In fact, what it largely is are people with very strong political convictions who are looking for topics and sites in which to debate their convictions. It's kind of, there are many aspects of this with sort of the Tea Party versus the Democratic Party, kind of playing it out. And these are not political operatives. These are really, people with enough time on their hands to do this. Now, that does not answer that question. That's why this other critique of both the process and the presentation of the show, that it only reaches a limited audience and it does not engage constituents fully. That's totally legitimate. And it just is what it is. I guess the one thing that I would say is that let's not try to make this into something that it isn't. And this is something, again, we continue to work on. We look for ways in which to, if we want to have that more direct engagement, other and more appropriate venues for that. We have considered that. But the fact is we're not an NGO. And this is one of the problems of what universities are becoming. Universities are becoming NGOs in many ways. This university is leading that charge. And what, they become development agencies. So suddenly, we have whole institutions set up in order to solve the problems of the world, to take over for the UN and others, to kind of take. And in a sense, this seems, yes, of course, we all understand that this goes along with some of the activist desires in architecture schools. This all makes sense. But what we can do here uniquely that we can't do anywhere else is think about the assumptions, is to critique, in practice, the frame around the way practice is practiced, whether it's activist practice or professional practice or anything else. So that's really how we've thought about this, is what can you do uniquely in an institution like Columbia and an institution like MoMA and together that you can't do anywhere else, that an NGO can't do, that the storefront can't do, that an architectural practice working on their own can't do, that, whatever, housing advocate can't do. So that's our thing. In terms of the process of design and so on, we said that already, but there were open studios in which anybody could have come into PS1, but obviously that's a limited, self-limiting group, and it relates back to this other debate about the scope, the sort of scale. So that's the one thing I think we need to be sort of modest about, is not pretend that our sphere, our public spheres, are the public sphere. That's what I was saying earlier. That's the idealization, as if we all live in one happy world in which everybody has equal access to this debate. That's not true. This is a very unequal discussion. I mean, and the first step is to recognize that and take responsibility for it. Just in the same way that we recognize that the fact that we can have this discussion is constrained by a whole set of external parameters that we need to at least acknowledge, if not, immediately overcome. So, yeah. Okay.
Could you explain why home ownership is fictional? Yeah. Because most home ownerships, have a mortgage. It becomes fictional when there's a foreclosure. Right. But most homes aren't foreclosed, are they? Well, no, but I didn't mean to say, or to be understood, that ownership itself is a fiction, but rather that there are structures. There's a kind of social contract, let's say, that is put into place that involves homeowners, so-called homeowners, and banks to begin with. That is called a mortgage. A mortgage is a cultural artifact. It's an agreement, right, like any other form of debt, that if you're the bank and I'm the homeowner, that you have title to this house until I fully pay off this mortgage, which is a 30-year proposition,
And until that time, I can say that I own the house, but in legal terms, you own the house. And it's that relationship that, we're describing, and not exactly, okay, fiction is a sort of a maybe more dramatic way to put it, but it's a way of dramatizing the constructedness of that relationship, socially constructed kind of debt. Of course, there are situations in which somebody owns the house outright, and that is what it is. But it's never, even in those cases, as simple as that. And that's also the other side of this equation of the social contract is the contract with government, the more classical social contract, in which the understanding is that a certain dimension, a certain percentage, we could even say, of what enables that house to be a house is taken care of by tax subsidies and other things. So, for example, the roads to get to the house, the fire department's going to put out the fire if it's there, the police, the schools, the hospitals, the even until recently, a couple of decades, the electricity and other services. So actually, even depending on how you define like the house and what it is, because it's meaningless to own that house without all those other services. That there is also a kind of social contract that enables this fiction of that's also partly what I mean. That the fiction to be sustained is precisely by making the role of government invisible and pretending that it's privately owned exclusively. And that's why we make the case in the show and in the book and everywhere else that all housing is a form of infrastructure, including the privately owned house, because it's typically thought that it's a self-contained, independent unit, and it's not. It's totally dependent on all other, including, and most famously and predominantly in the U.S., the tax subsidy that comes with the mortgage. So, I don't know, you guys might not know, but if you own a house, you're paying the bank not just what it costs to buy the house, but interest on that loan. That interest is tax deductible. It means that you can use that interest to offset some of your taxes. And that you pay less taxes if you own a house. That's a form of government subsidy. The government is, in that sense, indirectly helping you buy that house. And that is part of the apparatus that produces this idea and the narrative of home ownership that is actually a collective apparatus. It's not just an individual apparatus. So in that sense, even the suburban house is at some level collectively made or sustained, if not owned outright. And that's the fiction that I'm alluding to. Does it make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Given that, I guess the unattainable utopian dream of having a home.
Or dystopian.
Sorry?
Or dystopian. It could, if it's okay. We'll go ahead. Yeah.
The utopian in the 50s and 60s has contributed to the problems that we're dealing with today. Is the intent of the exhibition to seduce the public out of this utopia?
Well, yeah. I don't know. I mean, seduce is not a term that we typically use, but why not? Yeah, but not out of like the idea of utopia. It's almost the opposite. That what one is. This is related to the fiction question. I'll give you an example. That after a few weeks after the show opened, there was another one of these public sphere moments. Was when MoMA, or not MoMA, another group called the Forum for Urban Design. It's a New York-based group of people with interest in real estate and in urban issues. Organized a forum at MoMA. It was a small forum. It was by invitation, but it was mainly, and this was a panel with a group of developers, very large developers who build a lot of this stuff, And one after the other, I have to. For me, this was a really challenge to hold one's tongue and keep quiet. But I was forced to listen to developers lecture me and everybody else about how unrealistic all of this was. Now, at some level, this is unrealistic, but whose reality are we talking about here? It's the reality that's controlled by the interests that are represented by these individuals, these developers. That's, in other words, reality can change, right? So to describe this kind of the reversal of your characterization would be that if not in the project itself, because one of my criticisms that they're too realistic. It's not that they're too utopian or substitute one utopia for another. They're actually rather realistic. We know we know you can build these things. You know how to do this. They've run the numbers. They've got the spreadsheets. But they're what they, I think, in a sense, too quickly do is accept the reality as given by the developers. Now, if we learned anything in 2008, then we learned how fragile that reality, that so-called reality is. We learned something about the constructedness of that reality. And so this is an intervention in that constructedness. It's a utopian intervention in the sense that one is being asked to imagine that the world could be different. Not just that the typology of the house or collective housing or environmental systems or whatever, but that the system itself, the housing system in a way, and the financial system and the social system of which that is a part, could be different. So it's like, that's why I responded to your characterization by saying dystopia versus, so this is, you could say, the framing of this is a sort of, it's a mildly and modestly utopian response to the dystopia of the so-called realism of developers. The realism is that masks itself as authoritative because the money is behind it and various political forces are behind it, is what's being challenged. The realism, the statement, this is real, which is the statement, that's what power always does. The role of power is to tell you that something is real. So, go ahead.
It's interesting because although it is real to us because we all have a design background, to actual laymen I was observing in the exhibition, they couldn't associate,
sure.
So I guess that's why it is a dystopia, but then it's how do you actually get them on board, get the common people on board, and get even developers who are producing our housing stock to get on board with a shift in building typologies that can sustain us later.
Well, that's the reason that this is really conceived as an intervention at many levels in a more general conversation. Because, I think the first thing you have to do is dispense with the idea of the common person. That there's some other category of human who doesn't have the specialized and elite knowledge that we have. It's like saying you can't understand biology because you're not a biologist. You can, of course. This is why we intervene in biology in lots of ways without having to, or we accept those interventions, we imagine those interventions, we imagine others, and maybe we can't imagine others. But this is about what one can and cannot imagine, but it's also basically claiming that does not occur, that act of imagining does not occur in some neutral space. It occurs in a kind of playing field, that is invisibly defined by certain rules. And so so the problem is not so much whether some common person can or cannot, because I can give you dozens of examples, hundreds of examples of so-called common people perfectly willing and able to see this, children having no problem with this whatsoever. And by the way, there's nothing more common than a child. It's actually the other way around. It's the narrative that say, this is impossible. We cannot understand this. How could this be? The things that scare us are not the things that we're looking at. It's the frame around the things that we're looking at. The same could be said for political speech. The most vivid example in this country, I think, as I said before, was not in housing, but in healthcare, where the very simple fact is why, one was not allowed to say, and still isn't, Canada, when one speaks about the American healthcare system, because Canada is basically single-payer welfare, state-sponsored healthcare system. It's changing in lots of things, but that is just not, that's scary, it's unimaginable, it's communist, it's all these things that not actual people are like threatened by, but interests are threatened by. And our job is to name those interests and say, no, it's actually developers in this case who are the problem. I'm sorry, what we have to actually do is change the way power speaks. By speaking back to power, and that's what one can do within an academic setting. That is much less easy to do in a space in which the rules are made in advance by the. Again, of course, you're still going to have a political debate. You're going to have facts and values will still be debated, but they will be debated in a less constrained way than they are when one works with these fictions intact. Yeah.
I have two questions. First, I was wondering if any teams they had any sociologists on board to foresee or make an assumption of social impacts and consequences of proposed projects. Also, if your institution have any plan to recoding this like public brand on this to market it better or
to market. What do you mean, like?
For example, well, today it was in news that in Virginia they changing sea rise level to flooding, so they can.
Oh, we changed the terminology. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
if you have any
of course. Like not say public, but say something else, because you're not allowed to say public. Yeah, I know that was discussed a lot early on, and I actually refused that one because I think that's. Yes, that's what a marketing executive might decide to do if one was being instrumental about it. But I am enough of a kind of optimist to think that we should be able to use our language as it ought to be used. And now, actually, I'm not satisfied with the term public. That's the funny thing is that I think the term public is too constraining. It's got a lot of baggage associated with it. It's very white male, actually, if you think about it. In Greece, it was only the male property holders who could actually participate in what was retroactively called the public sphere. In Athens, I mean, in not contemporary Greece, but that's another story. But in ancient Athens, that's why this whole thing about the Greek metaphors, that the idealized public sphere is already over-coded and lots of. That's why I don't want to fetishize the term, but at the same time, I'm not going to throw it out. And we should be allowed to speak like that. That's part of what I mean about talking back to the systems that insist that we reinvent our language because we have to speak in code. It's like a censorship regime in which we're not allowed to speak openly. We have to speak in code. And I insist upon this partly as an academic because if you can't say that from the university, and to some extent the museum is related to the university, it's a more sort of protected space, let's say, in which we should be able to have a more open. This comes up a lot with controversial exhibitions, usually art exhibitions, in which issues or certain kinds of imagery is used. That's offensive to people, but we should be able to have a more open and shall we say public discussion about these matters. So that's why I insist on it. Maybe stubbornly, I admit, and maybe counterproductively, but I still insist on it. Yeah. What? Oh, you want the mic? Yeah. Nobody wants to ask about like architecture and stuff. Yeah. Oh, well.
No, I was rather curious about this because of course everybody is producing another fiction of the constituency of this particular project.
Right.
When of course the constituency of this project are the ones that lost the ability to participate in the fiction.
That's right.
They disappeared. They were evicted.
Right.
They don't have credit. They were discredited in literal terms,
sure,
which means that, of course, they can't use things while they are paying it. No?
Yeah.
They can't pretend that things are theirs, and they use them and participate on this particular fiction. Right. They were evicted from this fiction, no? And we are trying to replace them in these and call other constituencies.
Right, but that's one reason I want to insist on the term public, because however tainted the term is and however limited it is, it still carries some of that idea in it that there is a collective, and it's maybe not a universal collective, that's the ideal version, but it's a more inclusive collective than any of the other language that we have. Like if you use the term resident, for example, which is the usual code word for people, then you're already excluding the people you're discussing. The people who we're talking about are, for example, and this is what's actually happening in many of these places, are migrant workers who don't have papers. That's like at one end of the scale. There are also people who are, sort of white blue collar workers who've been laid off, who can't pay the bills. There's a full range of dispossession, let's say, that is represented as the overlapping constituencies for this. And I would want to really insist that we don't make the assumption. I mean, maybe this is a way to generalize your point, that we, whoever we are the public. In other words, that this project is about we, and it's about who is not we. It's anybody else who is not part of this discussion, who has no access to this discussion, But it's not as simple as simply putting a microphone or a TV camera in front of a person representing that group and saying, what do you think? It's an act of, you could call epistemic violence, to use a certain kind of language. There's a kind of paternalism and you know, sort of, so really this is the problem. It's totally not addressed by this show. It's something you cannot do in a museum of modern art, or, you know, in the way that we're doing things here. It just was off the table. But it's on the table as a question, not as a strategy. The question is, how is one of that could loosely be termed one of empowerment from below. In other words, how to develop a real an informed and critical debate that does not just include people because it makes you look good if you know, but actually learns from those who are structurally excluded from this situation. And that is, you know, I've said it before, I'll say it again, that's actually completely was ignored by virtually everybody in the show. We didn't push it enough curatorially. We're trying to push it now more from the Buell, but there are very, very significant limits on that. And I mean, that's one of the virtues of old-fashioned public housing, is that even if it's patronizing, and it is, I mean, and there's all kinds of other forms of real violence associated with the policies, very discriminatory and so on. It does, because it carries a shadow of this old ideal of an inclusive idea of the public, that it does actually include those folks who, and so actually what if you talk to people, for example, who work in public housing, there are lots of architects, people from this school who design housing, or they manage it, or somehow, their perspective is rather different, because on a day-to-day basis, they are learning from the people who are living in these apartment buildings that have, you know, who have no voice whatsoever in the academic debates over what constitutes an apartment building. And so there, you know, I could say the best that we've been able to do here is to work on the mediating levels, like the translation from one constituency to another. Not, you know, we're not pretending that there's a direct channel. Yeah. So the person right next to you had a question, no?
No, I was just wondering if the reason why we have those debates instead of maybe the debates that we could like to have about those kind of exhibitions is because of the way we expose the problem. Mm-hmm. Not where we expose the problem or who expose the problem, but also the way we expose it. In the sense that in this exhibition there was a lot of care about space conditions and a final product, yeah, whilst all the things related to political and cultural and economic, yeah, all the things that we are discussing right now were only narrative. Yeah. We're not explained in a different way. So maybe we as architects, we have the power, yeah, or whatever, to like shock the people with another kind of expression that is not only narrative, that is not only words, right, and that is not also a finished product.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you know, that was a deliberate decision. We made a decision. Actually, my ideal version of this show was and remains, in each case, a big model and a movie. That's it, and with a short explanation of the thing. Now, probably that would have been even more difficult in the terms that you just mentioned. But the reason for that is that maybe this is a mistake, but I don't think it is myself. But it probably is too steep of a hill to climb in one exhibition. That you know, the classical way of getting into this question, which is a little bit of it in the show, is to run the numbers. To show, you know, poverty is explained by numbers. And that map that's on the wall, which was designed by MoMA, does that. The sort of infographics type show. And we made a very specific decision not to do an infographics type of exhibition, partly because what I felt, at least, Barry, we all had different reasons, but, you know, let's say we agreed on this. But I feel that actually one of the risks of that is that numbers, before you even walk into the room, numbers have an authority that stands in for the truth. See, what I'm trying to say is that we're trying to tell the truth. The truth is that those numbers are supported by, they're not caused by, but they're partly supported by something like a fiction or a collective imaginary, sort of an idea, a fantasy, but not like some ephemeral thing, something that's real, that's sort of material and tangible, the house itself, right? And that is much more difficult to get at if you kind of put all the numbers on the wall, because I think most museum goers, including architects, are going to just be satisfied with the numbers and say, yes, I understand. There is poverty in Africa. And they will have it will be just as abstract to them as it was before they walked. Of course there's poverty. Now we know, it's basically telling us what we already know. And that was the wager of this thing. I'm still willing to do this, is to try to find a way to get into the heads of, to get into the sort of occupy the sleep patterns, the unconscious of museum goers. Now it turns out, to get into that's what the code word dream is meant to indicate. It's let's say, if the show was curated by a psychoanalyst who had a knowledge about what dreams actually do, then it may use numbers, but it might use them in a different way, or it might use some other kind of material. But that's, again, the point about saying this is a cultural show, not a think tank kind of a show. Now, maybe that's too extreme. It's maybe artificial to make that distinction, but that was the distinction we made. And that's why that type of information it's there, but it's usually on the small screens, or it's in the video, the audio part, or it's harder to get at. It's in the catalog. I just don't, I have this, how many biennials have there been? Is this going to be another one because it's going to be about social responsibility and Occupy Wall Street and everything? We'll run the numbers. They're going to, datascapes, poverty in Africa, and again, those numbers are going to prevent, I think, a more truthful discussion about what's at stake, because those numbers produce a kind of distance. Okay, I get it. And what we're really trying to do with the models and the movies is to produce a kind of proximity, and say that's why it's about America. It's about where you are now. It's not about the poverty on the other side of the world, the poverty in this country. And that's harder, actually, to get across. I don't think very many people, there's all kinds of problems. MoMA has a long history with this issue. The best way to get to this, what I would say, is go down to the other show that is kind of a partner show, the Rivera show, downstairs on the second floor, and look at the piece called Frozen Assets, which is about Wall Street, and it's a very vivid critique of Wall Street in the 1930s, after the previous depression, or during. And there you get a very visceral, aesthetic kind of interpretation of the structures of finance and dispossession and poverty that organized the previous financial crash. So, unfortunately, nobody rose to the occasion and made a movie that did that. It would have been nice, what can you say? What else? I thought I saw other hands. What time is it? We have time? Up to you. It's up to you, whatever you want to do. What, is that one? Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one.
He's got one.
I mean, with all this emphasis on the public, why, and since you have in the writing also you equated at some point suburbanization with the polis, why to choose suburbia? I mean, which in a way is at the 0 degree of the polis, since there is no agora anymore.
Yeah, I know. I'll tell you. Can I tell a story? Okay, there are two stories. First of all, because first of all, there is a debate. It's not that there's no debate. Okay. The debate is kind of owned by the group called the New Urbanists, for whom the suburbs are the site in which the future of the cities, of any kind of idea of the city, is going to be negotiated, and then that gets fed back into big cities. So this kind of basically the idea is the idealization of the village. This was a polemical. This whole thing is a polemical engagement with the New Urbanists. We again invited. I don't know if you know how many of you know, like Duane and Plater-Zyberg, and maybe some of you have worked for them. I don't know. But Liz Plater-Zyberg came and we debated it, and we had various kind of things. But one of the reviews of the show in a journal, in a kind of online magazine, that that is largely sympathetic, let's say, to some of the views of the new urbanists, is that complained that none of the architects, in not just the sites, they were happy with the sites because they like for them the suburbs are the front lines, and we agree with them actually. So that's part one. We agree that the suburbs in this country and around the world, I can give you other suburbs around the world that are also on the front. That doesn't mean that cities are irrelevant, but it means that that's the point. You know, the crisis is there. Okay, now, okay. But what their response to you is that no, there is a polis there. It's the village green. It's the town square. It's the community center. It's the idea of the village rather than the city that is celebrated. Now this, of course, does not. None of this, the framing of the show nor the projects, you know, idealize anything about villages. As far as I would say, there's a little bit of it, but not not too much. So the question then is there a there? Is there anything that one can work with, can develop, or just kill the suburbs? And you know, if you were king, then you would just erase them and move everybody to cities. Now, the way that this was taken up in this review of the show was that they were happy that we were working in the suburbs and patted us on the back. There's all these kind of like dances that are done publicly and privately about making friends and not being enemies and then being enemies again and arguing and not arguing. But so we were patted on the back for the suburb part. But then the complaint was, it's an interesting one, but a funny one, was that none of the architects in this show were chosen, who were chosen have practices in suburbs. They're all from cities, big cities. Like, so again, it's a bit of a version of this urban elites telling the poor suburbanites what they're going to do, how they should live. And so we ran the numbers. And I'm going to estimate, okay, there are 5 teams, just of the principal architects in the show. There are 5 teams, 3 of which are couples. So that's 6 plus 2 is 8, plus the 2 curators, Barry and myself. Of those 8, 2 people are not from the suburbs. And that's Yunjin Song and Amal Andros. Yunjin is from, she and Michael Bell were one team, and Yunjin is from Seoul, and Amal Andros is from Beirut. Everybody else is from, one way or another, like America, and myself included, and Barry included. So, and we were happy to talk about this. So that was a kind of red herring, but on the other hand, that fact is probably not, and of course many of the other consultants and other people, the various sociologists and everybody else involved, had experience one way or the other. In a way, I would say, in a kind of confessional moment, that the fact that we're all in some sense refugees from the suburbs has made us aware both of the problems that you're noting and the absentee, the kind of, let's say, the kind of emptiness of the whole thing, but at the same time that story that there's no there is false. And you know, what I usually say to this is actually you should go to, there's lots of good movies that explain this. I used to do this. We used to do, in the summer, we used to show movies, do you do movies anymore? Yeah, he used to do it also, but for a while we were showing some of these. Like Todd Haynes films, like Safe. Have you seen Safe? It's basically about the San Fernando Valley in outside of Los Angeles. That treat life in these spaces as real life, as human life, as social life. Because social life does occur in the suburb. No, it's not the Agora, but the Agora was not the Agora either, and that's why we have to be careful about idealizing. And so the fact is, it is possible to collectivize the suburbs. It is possible to think in the plural in these spaces. The new urbanists have their way of doing it, and I think it's reductive and ideologically, let's say, overdetermined. But one of, again, the claims of this show is that the city in its classical forms is not the only site of social encounter. And I think, to be honest, that many of us, at least intuitively, want to insist on this because we grew up there. And I can tell you that, the high school is maybe some of you agree, is a social space.
I have no doubt that there's social space and social spheres in Serbia, but then what I want to say is that then this means, in a way, entails the failure of architecture to stage that kind of public space?
Well, no, you could say failure or not, but I would rather put it in less dramatic terms and maybe at the same time be more architectural about it by saying, okay, a name for this in America, a big name for this is Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright's idea about the city was, I don't know, again, Broadacre City, the Usonian House, these are all models, they're counter models to New York, Paris, London, the big metropolis. Not just European models, but also other American cities, Chicago, etc. And in those houses, those Wright houses, they imagine a city, they imagine a polis, they imagine a collective. But we can, because we know how to read those houses, we can read the limits of that imagination. And the actual societies that those houses, in a sense, conjure up. Mm-hmm. So you could say that we were inviting people to do here was to propose an alternative to Frank Lloyd Wright. Mm-hmm. Not just an alternative to update Rem Koolhaas in the American suburbs, but to take on Wright. Mm-hmm. Now, I can't say that anybody really did that. It would have been an interesting move, but probably most people use the language of another time and place to articulate their response. But that would have okay. I mean, the social space of the, shall we say, one of the main social spaces of the classic American suburb, this is a problematic one, it's a difficult one, but it's real, is the church. Yeah. Now, actually, this election, just watch television while you're here in America, watch TV, listen, read the blogs and whatever, and you'll understand the role that the church, in various forms, that religion plays in constructing you heard the guy, the first line in that discussion, I see it when I pass on my way to church. And that's planned. That's not an accident. It's a meaningful statement. And so these spaces, mega churches, small communities, it's also part of the new urbanist ideal. The church on the village green is a site of collectivity. It's also a site of collective fantasy, of sort of the construction of what we could call a social imaginary. So you could say that what we are attempting to do here is to secularize the suburbs. And that's partly what I think that fellow was reacting to. He recognized this. I think he understood that actually this was an intervention into the collective imaginary of this space, the social space of the not just the kind of isolated individual watching television on the couch, right? It's an intervention into the space of the church. Yeah, that's my answer to it. Yeah. Of course, don't forget. Okay, never mind. We'll keep going. But yeah. All right. What else? Are we done? And don't forget. I'll add one more caveat. That it's exactly if when you do your history classes, you've all done your architectural history classes. You'll remember that they started with churches and temples and other religious buildings. That's the way that architecture enters the world. Yeah. Architecture enters the world by being architecture. Not by being sociology. It's my answer to, or not. Yeah. Okay. We collaborate. We collaborate and we translate across these spheres. But it's the very moment, the figure of the polis, of the agora, of the classical figures of public life, are themselves coded. I mean, what is the polis but a space populated by gods? And populated, certain kinds of phantoms that are different than the phantoms that populate, let's say, the shopping mall, but they're still kind of conjurations. They're still, as it were, objects of shared societal, communal production. And so it's that we're trying to get at. It's not so much that there's a paradigm, there's a typology of this or that space, or even a certain kind of magic about density or some of the other metrics. Although obviously you can see that my colleagues who were in the show pretty much all thought that density was a good thing. But we didn't tell them that. I mean, they thought that. I don't know, he raises it, but we should we...
That means by understanding social interest.
Yeah, what do you mean?
You raised that architecture happens by, going toward not toward, but architecture happened by, for example, designing a church.
Well, of course, but that's a very traditional form of architecture. I mean, in the sense that when you did the Renaissance, if you did in that's what you looked at. You looked at churches and classical architecture as temples largely, all the way up. Modernism, they don't usually show you the churches, but there are a lot of modernist churches. the basic idea is very much one of trying to make available, make visible, and make aesthetically, I mean through aesthetic means, understandable, a secular public sphere, a shared, literally spaces that are shared, but also a conversation, a debate, a space in which agreements and disagreements can occur on secular terms. Because, you know, it's, again, we can go on forever about how finance itself speaks the language of religion. Yeah. Well, and faith, trust, debt, etc. So, you know, that's in maybe another class, but I think you get the hint. And housing, in the way, in its, you know, traditional architectural form, basically its high modernist forms, has traditionally been a way to speak a different language, and that's a kind of move that indirectly we're making, and I think, again, people have picked up on that in criticizing that, frankly, yeah. Okay, are we done? Yeah. We're done, okay, good.
Thank you very much.
Have fun. See you later.